In 1897, British soldiers marched into a city they did not understand, burned it to the ground, and looted thousands of artworks. Not because the city was primitive, but because it wasn't. What they found in Benin shocked them so deeply that they spent the next century explaining it away, minimizing it, and quietly lying about it. This is not a story about cultural contact or unfortunate misunderstandings. It is the story of a civilization so organized, so artistically advanced, and so politically disciplined that Europe could not afford to let it stand, because its existence alone threatened the myth that made empire possible. The Benin Empire did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was inconvenient. Long before Britain industrialized, long before much of London was paved and sanitized, Benin City was a planned metropolis. Streets ran in deliberate straight lines, laid out with intention rather than chance. Residential quarters were organized by profession and rank. Markets were regulated. Trade routes were monitored. Royal authority was centralized and enforced without apology. Crime was punished swiftly, sometimes brutally, because order was considered sacred. This was not chaos. It was governance. Benin was not a village. It was not a loose collection of tribes. It was a state, ruled by an absolute monarch known as the Oba, supported by a layered bureaucracy of chiefs, palace officials, priests, guild leaders, and administrators. Power flowed downward in rigid hierarchies. Every role was defined. Every ritual had political meaning. Nothing happened by accident. Law in Benin was not informal custom. It was institutional. Disputes were settled through structured courts. Oaths carried real consequences. Corruption was punished severely, including among elites. The Oba was not merely symbolic. He was the center of the state, both spiritual and administrative, bound by tradition yet feared for his authority. European visitors knew this. They wrote about it. When Portuguese traders arrived in the late 15th century, they did not describe savagery. They described discipline. They described a city whose streets were wider and cleaner than many European towns of the same era. They described a court governed by strict protocol and ceremony. Later Dutch and British accounts echoed the same observations, even when their tone shifted from admiration to resentment. Benin's earthworks alone would later shock modern archaeologists. Stretching for thousands of kilometers when combined, they formed one of the largest man-made structures in human history, rivaling the Great Wall of China in scale. These were not decorative walls. They were defensive systems, engineered over centuries, maintained by coordinated labor and centralized planning. Benin controlled trade fiercely. Pepper, ivory, cloth, coral beads, and later firearms moved through its markets, but always on Benin's terms. Foreign merchants were allowed presence, not power. They paid tribute. They followed rules. Borders were enforced. Nothing entered or left without approval from the palace. And that control, economic, political, psychological, was the real threat. By the 19th century, as European powers scrambled to divide Africa among themselves, Benin remained stubbornly independent. It refused British treaties that would have reduced it to a client state. It restricted trade access instead of opening markets. It ignored imperial demands instead of negotiating submission. It behaved like a sovereign state because it was one. But the most dangerous thing Benin possessed was not its walls, or its laws, or its army. It was its art. The Benin Bronzes were not decorations. They were records. History cast in metal. Kings, queens, warriors, diplomats, rituals, victories, punishments, and court life rendered with anatomical precision and technical mastery. Every plaque documented power. Every head preserved memory. Every object reinforced legitimacy. These works required advanced metallurgical knowledge, complex lost wax casting techniques, and highly organized hereditary guilds operating under royal patronage. This was not improvisation. This was institutional knowledge refined over generations. When British soldiers finally encountered these objects, many could not accept what they were seeing. Some claimed the bronzes were made by Portuguese craftsmen. Others suggested they came from ancient Egypt or some vanished civilization. Anything but African. Because if Africans could produce art of this level, then the entire moral justification for empire collapsed. By the late 19th century, Britain wanted Benin neutralized. Not reformed. Not persuaded. Neutralized. The city represented defiance. Its control over trade interfered with British commercial ambitions. Its independence challenged imperial authority. Its very existence contradicted the story Britain told about itself. All that was needed was an excuse. In January 1897, a British delegation attempted to enter Benin City despite explicit warnings from the Oba. The timing was not accidental. Benin was observing a sacred ritual period during which no foreigners were permitted to enter the capital. This was not a suggestion. It was law. The Oba requested they wait. They refused. The delegation advanced anyway. They were armed. They were warned. They were violating a sovereign boundary during a forbidden period. They were not diplomats walking innocently into danger. They were agents testing a limit. They were attacked. Several British officials were killed. History would later label this event the Benin Massacre. But that framing quietly removes context and responsibility. It avoids the uncomfortable question. Why was an armed foreign party marching into a restricted capital against direct instruction? The answer is simple and deeply uncomfortable. Britain needed a reason. The response was swift, overwhelming, and pre-planned. Over 1,000 soldiers were deployed. Equipped with Maxim machine guns, artillery, and rockets. Against a city with no modern military defenses capable of resisting such force. This was not justice. It was annihilation. The operation was called a punitive expedition. A polite phrase for mass destruction. Benin City was set on fire. The royal palace was destroyed. Homes were flattened. Thousands were killed. Survivors fled into surrounding forests, carrying nothing but memory. The Oba was captured, tried, and exiled. An empire that had stood for centuries was dismantled in weeks. And then came the looting. British troops stripped the city bare. Bronze heads, plaques, ivories, ceremonial regalia, objects taken from shrines, from altars, from the palace itself. Anything valuable, anything symbolic, anything that carried meaning. Over 4,000 artworks were taken. Not hidden. Not smuggled. Sold openly in Europe to pay for the invasion itself. The violence did not end with the fire. It continued quietly, behind glass and polite museum walls. The bronzes were shipped to London, Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and New York. Museums displayed them proudly, not as evidence of African statecraft or historical continuity, but as trophies of empire. For decades, labels described them as primitive art, detached from their context, their function, and their theft. Artists were listed as unknown. Civilizations were reduced to curiosities. Entire academic disciplines were built studying Benin art while refusing to confront how it was acquired. Europe did not just steal Benin's treasures. It stole the narrative. The message was subtle but powerful. Africa could be admired aesthetically, but not respected politically. Studied intellectually, but never credited historically. Displayed safely, but never returned. And the lie worked. Even today, many institutions resist restitution. They argue legality, as if conquest were a contract. They argue preservation, as if Africa were incapable of protecting its own heritage. They argue universality, as if stolen objects somehow become neutral once placed behind European glass. But the truth is simple and visible. If Benin had truly been primitive, no one would be fighting this hard to keep its art. The bronzes are valuable because they expose a lie modern history still depends on that Europe civilized Africa, rather than disrupted functioning societies for profit and power. Benin City in Nigeria proves Africa did not need saving. It needed to be stopped. The destruction of Benin was not merely the destruction of a city. It was the destruction of an alternative future. A future where African states modernized on their own terms. Where trade was negotiated rather than imposed. Where political evolution occurred internally rather than under foreign command. The fall of Benin sent a message across the continent. Resistance would be punished absolutely. Sovereignty would be erased decisively. Memory would be exported and controlled. And it worked. Even now, more than a century later, the story makes people uncomfortable. Because Benin is not ancient enough to be dismissed as myth. It is not distant enough to feel harmless. Its fall is documented. Its art is visible. Its theft is undeniable. To acknowledge Benin honestly is to admit that colonialism was not a civilizing mission. It was an economic and psychological war, fought as much against truth as against people. Some bronzes are now being returned. Slowly. Reluctantly. Often with conditions that still imply ownership. But restitution is not just about objects. It is about admitting what was done, and why it was done. The Benin Empire was not erased by time. It was erased by choice. And the fact that the world is still arguing over its remains proves that the fire of 1897 never truly went out.